I wanted to do this, probably be my last video dealing with the property theft issue. Basically, the argument has been made that there are certain characteristics conceptually between the concept of property, including private property, and the concept of taxation, and that as such the two are equivalent. And this has been stated repeatedly by Catavan as if taxation is theft, then property is theft. The argument basically being that if I take something to be my own property and I exclude others from use, I am denying them use of something, and I'm expecting that to be legitimate. I'm expecting them to respect the claim for that private property, and likewise taxation would be denying some use to somebody, but there's an expectation that that's okay. And so since the holding of the property is dependent on some kind of societal agreement, then it's okay for society to impose a similar agreement and say, well, you can exclude others from that property, but then we can exclude you from that property. And there's a couple problems with here. I think it's correct to say that there are certain elements between the two concepts that are similar, but we can find similarities between all sorts of concepts, and that does not make them equivalent. And the concept of taxation, or the act of taxation, and the act of property acquisition are not equivalent, or at least not necessarily equivalent, and they are different both in their consequence and in their very nature. That's one problem. The other problem is the assumption that private property entails some sort of contract or understanding with society at large. One of the main points in my previous video of property rights in the Neolithic Revolution is that this is really not the case, or at least not necessarily the case. The clearest example is the person who lives in basic isolation. Maybe not, I mean, hypothetically in total isolation, but for the point of the theory, his holding of property might just be isolated. So he could live in a town and whatever, and if he leaves and he goes out into the wilderness far away to where no one knows that he's there, and he builds a cabin or whatever and creates property, it is unclear how exactly some understanding was required with anybody, let alone with an amorphous society at large. He has simply acted on his own, and if he's really isolated, that he doesn't even need any kind of agreement or understanding with any individual person, let alone society at large, to maintain his property. That's a hypothetical, theoretical situation. It's not one that's altogether that practical, although it does actually probably occur at least sometimes, even today, and certainly in the past, although I doubt it was ever the most common type of property scenario. The second type is one where she has immediate, basically neighbors, people who are in the immediate vicinity. And I described in that video how in that situation it would likely not be, there likely never was a case, or is unusual, where everybody in a situation would get together, say all the settlers in a valley that has just been populated or in a community would get together and say, let's hash out basically a constitution that probably wouldn't be written, but written or oral, and basically legal and property norms and how we're going to do everything. And this would be kind of like an explicit social contract. That is actually very, very unlikely to have occurred, except much later in the societal development, and long after property, and especially private property, already exists. What is much more likely is going to be a series of bilateral understandings. So the neighbor on say to your north, you develop between the two of you an understanding of what's going to happen at the border of your property. If there even is a border, maybe it's not a strict one so much as we will alternate use, or maybe types of behavior, that sort of thing. And then you might enter into another bilateral understanding with the person to your east and to the west, and likewise your neighbor to the north, he'll develop a bilateral one. And in this case, it is true that you are coming to understandings and arrangements with other people, but the number of people and the people that you're coming to those arrangements with is a definite number of people. It is a certain these number of people, and there's no point really. And I mean, it's muddying the waters to then say, well, there's some kind of debt or understanding or social contract that is somehow developing here with society at large. You could say that, well, it's society because that's what we're going to call syllogistically any group of people, fine. But in fact, what we have is a series of bilateral agreements, either explicit or implicit. Both can be valid. Obviously, implicit ones are harder to resolve in the event of a dispute, but they can be valid and they can be workable. Explicit ones are much clearer. Written explicit ones are even more clear. But there isn't any point in that scenario, which I think is a very common, probably the most likely, most typical scenario in which property norms develop. There's no state, or there's no, well, state, there's no point in that where some greater debt to a larger society comes into play. It doesn't exist. So I have that's one problem. So you can have a property understanding with either nobody because you're isolated, or with the set people with which you interact, at which point it's meaningless to speak of then some other arrangement with an amorphous society, which is, aside from not really existing, is going to boil down to third parties simply coming and asserting rights based on the agreements between you two. So me and my coworker might have an arrangement for sharing our company car. I buy the gas, he fills the tires, and and whatever it is, we have hashed that out. It wouldn't make any sense at all for some third party, some random person to show up and say, well, you have this understanding, this allocation of resources, broadly speaking, a normative proprietarian system, and as such you owe society, and I'm here to collect, and so I'm going to take your car or use it for some. That doesn't make any sense. Now, the other problem I have with the argument is that it is non-equivalent. This New Year's, right around the January 1st, I had a few days off work, but I couldn't go home, and I was stuck here with my coworker, who, as it turned out, were not very similar personality-wise, but he was actually a big Ron Paul supporter. He wouldn't call himself a libertarian, he'd call himself a conservative, but he was a pretty strong Ron Paul supporter, and he was a pretty big gun nut, and so we got along pretty well. And we went to Walmart, and he said, well, I'm going to go look at the guns. Now, I love guns, but I don't typically think of Walmart as the place to get them. Usually their selection's a little skimpy, and I hadn't even occurred to me to go there. And I said, sure. And so we went and we were looking at them, and there really was one gun that I had been in the market for a while that I wanted, and it is a very common gun, the Remington 870 12-gauge shotgun, of which it's one of the most popular, maybe the most popular shotgun ever. Anyway, totally tangential. I had just been paid, and so I thought, well, what the hell? Maybe I'll, and I decided as we were walking there, if they have a shotgun that I would like, I'm not going to buy something I don't really want, but if they have what I would like, which would be a Remington 870 tactical shotgun, I will buy it. I know about how much they cost, and I had plenty of money, and we went there, and sure enough, they had a couple 870s, and 2 or 3 of them had the Woodstocks, but one was tactical. And he actually saw it first, my partner, and he said, well, may I look at that? And of course, the guy at the register let him look at it, and then he said, well, would you like to look at it? And I said, sure. And I looked at it, and I had it in my hands, and then I looked at the cash register and said, I would like to buy this. And he said, all right, and we did the paperwork. Now, my coworker was a little bit miffed because he was thinking exactly the same thing I was. He was thinking maybe he would buy this gun. He likes guns. I don't know if he has a shotgun or not. I don't know all the details. And this is a good gun. And he was looking at this same material resource, the same bit of property, if you don't want to call that material resource. And he was getting in his mind the expectation of maybe using it. And so was I. And so I bought it, and I excluded him from owning it. I let him, touch it and everything and see it. We went home, and I kind of lorded it over him, like, oh, look, who's got the best shotgun in the house? Bringing my gun total to my apartment to 3. That's my traveling gun collection, not all of them. And he only had his 45. Anyway, the argument could be made, and I think correctly, that, well, look, he had an expectation of use, and you had an expectation of use, and you took possession, and so you have done something to him. You have excluded him from the use of the shotgun, and this is similar to taxation, because in taxation you earn something, you create something. Typically, actually, historically, taxation is you grow something, you have an expectation of use, and then the state comes and they also have an expectation of use and they take some of it. And so there was an expectation of use. However, you could say by acquiring this weapon or this piece of property, I'm excluding him. But let's have another scenario. So then after I pay for it, offer a whole bunch of money, I have an expectation of use. He did, but I've excluded him from it. And then I've actually paid a price. I've actually engaged. I've actually acted upon that. It's not just something I thought about, but something I actually did. I converted wealth that I had created before that was denoted in terms of money, and converted it into here. So it took, like a day's wages basically, paid for this gun. And so while we both had an expectation of maybe wanting it, we both had a desire to have it maybe, and we both maybe were thinking someday we will, I did a great deal more than he did. And if he were to simply come and take the gun, or some part of it, that would be an additional imposition on me than just excluding me from something I was maybe thinking about buying at some point. Like another example, say there's a piece of property that you encounter on a daily basis. Maybe you drive past it, maybe you see it, maybe it's in your neighborhood, and you think to yourself occasionally or maybe every day, like, I actually like that piece of property. It's a nice piece of land. Wouldn't it be kind of cool if maybe someday I built a house there? And or whatever, use it for some purpose. And you kind of think about this for a long time, and then one day you drive past it and somebody is building a house there. So obviously somebody else also had an expectation of use, and they are now acting on it and building a house there. And it would be justified to say, well, they're excluding my potential to use it, aren't they? And yes, that's correct, they are. But if you were to then walk up to them and say, well, listen, I had an expectation of use here, so I'm going to take it or part of it, is that equivalent to their having denied me what I had been thinking about? No, it's not. It's similar in some respects, but it's an order of magnitude more of an imposition. Practically speaking, on utilitarian grounds, it's a disaster. I mean, they're investing all this cost, all this effort, all these other material goods into it, and then you're just expropriating them. So you're not just dashing their expectations, you're destroying their future. You're altering it, and it's one that they've already acted upon. It's not something that a hypothetical, I'm thinking about maybe using this bit of land, or maybe using this material resource. I've already acted on doing it. And so it's different in that aspect. It's not equivalent. There's more to it. And then there's also the other problem is, in most cases, most other people do not have any kind of expectation of use. Maybe I have always thought about using that bit of land. Maybe there are a couple dozen or 100 other people around us who also were considering of maybe using that land, but the almost totality of humanity, or the country for that matter, has no even knowledge that the parcel of land even exists, let alone its characteristics. And I don't think you could argue that people who are ignorant of its very existence had any kind of expectation of use. And so in that sense, it's not just an order of magnitude different, it's totally different. The other problem is typically when people, in order for people to live, and especially in a free market society, they either have to be self-sufficient or they have to produce something that other people want. And so if you have an expectation of use for something, say a certain amount of acreage, and somebody else converts that into their property, say a farm, well, it may be true that your expectations are dashed, but you will still actually probably, in fact necessarily in at least some cases, have the benefits of that, because the farmer will be producing something and offering it for sale. And so rather than there having been simply unimproved wild land, which, unless you live in an area where, you know, the Garden of Eden, where all of our needs and desires are like manna from heaven, somebody, in order for you, if you want to benefit from natural resources, somebody has to start converting them to your use, and that's either going to be you or it's going to be somebody else. And if somebody else is doing it for you, they're taking all the risk, they're converting it into something, and they might lose, they might convert it poorly, or the conditions might change or not have been correct in the first place. And do you have to pay for that on a free market? No, you don't. They take on all the risk, and then the fruits of their labor, not to be overtly Lockean here, are made available to you. Now, that availability is usually conditional. Usually when people convert resources into goods that people want, they don't give them away for free, at least in general, all the time. Sometimes they will. Most people will donate to charity from time to time, and sometimes it's good business to allow free samples or whatever. But in general, it will be made available conditionally. So yes, I will allow you to have the fruits of my labor, but in exchange for something. And it could be barter. More likely it's going to be a monetary exchange. What's so bad about that? You know, the state is exactly the same. The state does not give unconditional goods. People will say, oh, but they don't make people pay. Well, you have to be a citizen of the state. You have to obey the state. You have to follow its rules. And if it deems you capable, you have to pay taxes. If the state says that I'm capable of paying taxes, which is just its own arbitrary, I mean, I've witnessed this firsthand, because at one point I was in the position where they didn't think I owed them any taxes. And then I basically became much more productive, even though I wasn't using any more of their services. I didn't drive more. I didn't use city utilities. I never used city utilities. Never lived in a place that I needed to. My use of government goods and services, so-called, didn't increase, but my income did. And so then they just decide, now you owe us, and it was literally hundreds of times more money. And if I don't pay that, they're not going to keep saying, well, you're not paying your taxes, but here, you still get to use all of our services. No, they'll arrest you and throw you in a cage. They'll exclude you. So government offers goods and services, but they are definitely conditional. And actually, rather than, say, the farmer who will say, well, I'll sell you these if you want them. If you don't want them, you don't have to pay for them. If I don't want government services, I still have to pay for them. So they are not only conditional in receiving them, but they're unconditional in you having to pay for them. So the resources made available on a private free market are several ethical grades easier to defend than those provided by government. Taxation is not equivalent to property holding, at least property holding that isn't based on actual expropriation of the physical goods somebody has already created. You could, again, argue that by me buying the shotgun when my friend was thinking about it, that I've expropriated the potential for him to do so. Sure, I can concede that. But that's many orders of magnitude less than if he were to have actually expended resources to that end. And, you know, we all have innumerable things that we think about maybe someday doing, and that alone is not any kind of basis for a claim to actually own those things if other people are going to go to the effort and labor to go and expropriate them, to use them and put them to use. To say, I see that you've been working hard on this farm these last couple of years. I love the barn that you've built and the capital you've developed and all that. But, you know, I've always secretly kind of wanted to do that myself, and so I'm going to take 25% of your crop. And it's not theft, because for you to have owned the farm in the first place, you had to have had some kind of social contract, and I'm collecting in the name of that social contract, which is what tax collectors are doing, basically, as far as the theory goes. And it's just totally bogus. First of all, he may have been working in isolation, in which case he doesn't owe anybody. He may have property understandings with other people, but not you, and a third party can't just come up and say, well, you have an agreement with A, B, and C, and I being X, and am hence entitled to not only enter into the same agreement, but to unilaterally dictate my own agreement, which is totally different. Because I don't know anybody in terms of private property who have a norm where certain elements of the population are just entitled to take whatever it is that they want. Now people say, well, governments can't do that. Well, actually, they reserve the right to do that. They do it intermittently. It's usually not wise for them to do that because it pisses people off. But there's no theoretical, ethical basis if you're going to say tax is okay, that there's some social contract, societal debt, and that the government, without any explanation, by the way, is somehow the claimant and legitimate holder of that debt. There's no part in that theory that says, well, they're only entitled to so much. If you believe in social contract theory, what's the delineation of that contract? How far does it go or does it not go? Does the social contract entitle some entity, and again, how that entity is, say, the government as opposed to, I don't know, the Catholic Church or the Boy Scouts, is never made clear to me. They claim it. I mean, the people in the government say, hey, this is the social contract. We're the inheritors of its legitimacy. But, I mean, if the Catholic Church said that and just said, hey, we're the glue that holds society together, every time you and another person shake hands and do a business contract, it's only because of the zeitgeist that we've provided, which actually there are religious people who do actually claim something to that effect. We would just say, oh, well, fine, then you can take whatever you want. No. And the other thing is, people say they're not going to take that much, but the theory doesn't say, well, they're only entitled to 50%, but not 55%. The theory is that there's some amorphous debt. Again, there's no point in talking about debt if it can't be delineated between the two, but there's just some debt that's racked up somehow, and that some particular group of people via elections, although why would that be? How would agrarian farmers, say in the Shenandoah Valley in Virginia, who may be completely ignorant of the proceedings of the Continental Congress, something that was common. I mean, there are lots of rural farmers in America had no idea that the Constitutional Convention was even going on. How are they bound by that in any sense? The fact that they would be bound to that and not be bound to a contract that, say, you and I sign and then go to fund, is totally based on hypocrisy. And I'm sorry that this video has just verged, or has been verging, into social contract theory. But hell, we might as well go there. I think I've pretty much already covered it. But you know, when libertarians question the social contract, I've always heard the argument, well, the social contract is valid because there's we're assuming that it already was valid, you know, that the people voting in the Continental Congress already had the authority to do that. But then you're assuming the very thing that's under question. You know, even if I concede that there is some kind of societal debt, which I don't, if I if I pay for the goods and services I use as I go, I'm not accruing some magical debt. You know, if you pay your Comcast bill for your internet, you know, they send you a bill and say, hey, these are the services you used. Which, by the way, I've canceled those before. There have been times I thought, you know, I don't value this anymore. And I go, I'm done. I don't want to pay for this. But what if at the end of the year they said, well, you paid us all the time, but really there were other debts. They're not for goods or services. But I mean, we can't point on a bill or an invoice to the things you used, but just generally the fact that you got along in life means that really we get another $5,000 now. So, you know, cough it up or you're going to prison. No one would take that seriously, yet a bureaucrat who doesn't provide you any goods or services or only very nominally and spends most of his time and money doing things that you think are atrocious or even evil comes and says, well, because you got along with Comcast, because you were able to buy a vehicle from a car company, because you had a job, because you were able to eat, even though you paid for all those things as you went, really you owe us for that. And the sum that we owe is again, there's no bill for actual services. Your tax bill is not a bill for services. When people say that, I'm like, really? Has anyone ever gotten a tax bill that delineated your use? How much you use this? I mean, just use the example. My tax bill increased 100-fold, and my use of government services, so and so, did not change. It might have even gone down. I mean, because like when I was working in Utah, I lived on an oil rig that provided its own power, wasn't hooked into a grid, made its own roads, maintained those roads, and I did use some government services because I had to drive in and out, but I'd drive in and I'd spend months there and then I'd drive out. And if I was paying tolls, my bill would likely have been less than $20 for the 6 months that I was there. But when I did TurboTax, what it said I owed the state of Utah was almost $1,000. For what? For what? I can't even vote there. And I didn't use their service. I was literally in the middle of the desert. And when I did drive on the roads, it would be to like a business, and I would pay money for food. And I was paying for that food. You don't get a bill, your tax bill doesn't say these are the services you use, this is how much you use them, this is how much you owe. It's an arbitrary declaration of what you owe. But, you know, they have a formula on how they pick it, but the formula doesn't have anything to do with how much you use the service at all. It's how much they think that they're entitled to based on how much you make. And it's just absurd. Now, people who believe in the state don't care about all that. They think the state is an engine for social change for good, and since they believe that, the state has to have revenue somehow, and it can't possibly raise enough by charging for services. And so since they want that end, then the means that it implies is secondary. And the fact that it's very vague and kind of doesn't make a lot of sense and relies on a hypocrisy that they don't apply to anybody else. The mob doesn't get to do this. The Catholic Church doesn't get to do this. You or I don't get to do this. But they do. Just never strikes them as a glaring omission. And then even if they say, well, maybe the morality or the ethics isn't that clear, I just like the solution. Yeah, but the end result is actually pretty shitty. The government provision of the so-called necessary goods and services is pretty terrible. And to go to all these gymnastics to justify what would otherwise, in any other circumstance, be considered theft, aka taxation, because you want to pay for something that's a crappy service anyway, that's a one-size-fits-all, fits nobody, basically, enormously expensive, politically motivated joke, strikes me as absolutely ridiculous. And the main reason so many people believe it is because one of those services that people get is 12 years or more of indoctrination. And that's somehow not, I mean, do people think that when you go to public school you're going to learn about how bad government is and all the problems in government? And no, you learn that the progression of history is the progression of government taking over society, and the more so government does that, the better society is. And well, we might say, well, society is better off now than it was before, and government has grown. Yeah. Correlation does not equal causation, though. That's, I mean, if you weren't learning to worship the government, you might have learned some logic at some point. So, yes. Taxation and theft, taxation and property do have certain cognitive similarities, just like having sex and rape do. But they're not equivalent, and they don't depend on each other. And it's, I think, just a really sorry attempt to justify taxation on the very flimsy claim that, well, if we don't have the principles that allow for private property allow for taxation. No, they're not equivalent. They don't require the same things. They don't come about in the same way. And yeah, it's totally ridiculous. I do agree, though. However, I just watched old Bitbutter video. Bitbutter, the English YouTube user. I think he made it several months ago, but he just uploaded it. And he did say, and I think this is correct, that he tries to avoid really charged rhetoric like taxation is theft. Not because he doesn't agree with it, because we end up getting into these huge debates like this, and that they don't necessarily go anywhere. So that's probably correct, at least some of the time. So other than that, though, I don't see any argument here. So, all right, peace.